In July 1518, in the city of Strasbourg, a woman named Frau Troffea walked out of her house and into the street and began to dance. There was no music. There was no festival. There was no occasion that anyone could identify afterward. No celebration, no communal gathering that might explain what she did. She simply began to move, her feet stepping, her body turning, her arms tracing patterns in the summer air of a cobblestone street in one of the most prosperous cities of the Holy Roman Empire. She danced for 6 days without stopping. By the end of the first week, 34 people had joined her. By the end of the month, the number had reached 400. They danced through the streets of Strasbourg, through the heat of a brutal summer, through exhaustion and injury and collapse. Some danced until their feet bled through their shoes. Some danced until their hearts gave out entirely. They could not stop. The dancing plague of 1518 is not a legend. It is not a piece of medieval folklore that has been embroidered over centuries until it became something stranger than it was. It is documented in physician notes, in city council records, in sermons preached from Strasbourg's pulpits, in the administrative correspondence of one of the largest and best-governed cities in the German-speaking world. The people who wrote about it were not credulous or superstitious by the standards of their time. They were physicians trained in the Galenic tradition, city officials responsible for the practical management of a large urban population, and clergymen who were, in 1518, on the eve of the Reformation, and more attuned than usual to the difference between spiritual experience and physical crisis. What they documented was a genuine public health emergency that lasted for weeks, affected hundreds of people, and killed an indeterminate number of them. And no one, then or in the 5 centuries since, has fully explained it. Strasbourg in 1518 was a city under extraordinary pressure. The harvests of the preceding years had failed repeatedly. Famine was not a distant abstraction. It was present in the streets, in the gaunt faces of the urban poor, in the mortality rates that the city's records showed creeping upward year by year. Syphilis had arrived in Europe 2 decades earlier and was spreading with a virulence that contemporaries found apocalyptic. The plague returned at intervals, the Rhine floods periodically, the economic dislocations produced by the increasing commercialization of agriculture were displacing rural workers into cities that could not absorb them. The poor of Strasbourg in 1518 lived within a horizon of suffering that was both immediate and without apparent end. The religious framework that was supposed to make suffering meaningful, the promise that endurance in this life would be rewarded in the next, was itself under strain, not yet openly challenged by Luther's Reformation, but already quietly questioned by a population that had endured too much for too long. Into this world in July 1518, Frau Troffea walked into the street and began to dance. The city's initial response was not alarm. The physicians and astrologers consulted by the city council concluded that the dancing was a natural illness, caused in the medical framework of the time by hot blood. The appropriate treatment was to allow the afflicted to dance until the fever ran its course. Movement was the cure. Acting on this advice, the city made an extraordinary decision. They hired musicians, they built a stage, they employed professional dancers to dance alongside the afflicted, believing that keeping them moving would exhaust the malady out of their systems. They opened 2 guild halls for the use of the dancers. They created, in effect, a public infrastructure for the epidemic. It made things catastrophically worse. Within days of the stage being erected and the music beginning, the number of people dancing swelled. More and more citizens joined the movement in the streets and guild halls. The physicians watched their prescribed cure amplify the disease they were treating. The dancers deteriorated. They could not eat. They could not sleep. Some were carried, collapsed, to rest, and then rose and began dancing again, as if something inside them could not permit stillness. Contemporary accounts, and there are multiple from different observers writing independently, describe the afflicted in terms that are not consistent with celebration or voluntary participation. Some wept as they danced. Some had expressions of torment rather than joy. Some called out that they were suffering, that their bodies were moving against their will, that they could not stop though they desperately wanted to. One account describes a woman who had been dancing for days, holding up her bleeding feet and begging to be released from whatever held her. She kept dancing. The city council eventually reversed course with a decisiveness that suggests they recognized their initial response had been disastrously wrong. They dismissed the musicians. They dismantled the stage. They issued prohibitions against secular dancing within the city limits. They arranged for the afflicted to be transported by cart, because many could no longer walk purposefully, only dance, to the shrine of Saint Vitus at Saverne, approximately 30 kilometers from Strasbourg. Saint Vitus was the patron saint of, among other things, epilepsy and nervous disorders, and the connection between his intercession and the dancing epidemic appears to have been made early. Red shoes were placed on the feet of the afflicted at the shrine, a symbolic gesture whose logic within the cult of Saint Vitus has been debated by religious historians since. By September 1518, the epidemic was over. The dancing stopped. Most of those who had been afflicted recovered. Records do not preserve how many died during the weeks of the plague's height, though contemporary accounts describe deaths from exhaustion, from cardiac failure, from the simple physiological impossibility of maintaining continuous physical exertion in summer heat without adequate food or water. In the 5 centuries since, researchers and physicians have proposed explanations for the dancing plague that span a wide range of mechanisms. The most scientifically developed modern hypothesis belongs to historian John Waller, who spent years investigating the case and published his conclusions in 2008. Waller's explanation centers on a phenomenon that 21st century medicine calls mass psychogenic illness, a condition in which genuine, involuntary, physical symptoms spread through a community through the mechanisms of social contagion, stress, and shared belief systems. The symptoms are real. The movement is real. The inability to stop is real. But the origin is psychological rather than pathological in the conventional medical sense. In Waller's framework, the specific content of the psychogenic episode, dancing specifically, rather than some other form of convulsive movement, was shaped by the religious culture of Alsatia. The cult of Saint Vitus in this region of Europe included a specific belief that the saint could, as punishment for sin, inflict compulsive dancing on those who offended him. This belief was not marginal or heterodox. It was part of the fabric of popular Catholic devotion in the Rhine Valley. And in Strasbourg in 1518, in a population pushed to the edge of its psychological endurance by years of famine, disease, and religious uncertainty, the conditions were in place for this specific belief to manifest as a genuine mass behavioral contagion. The dancing was not chosen. It was not voluntary, but it was shaped by the expectations and fears of the culture that produced it. The body expressing, in the only language that the community's belief system had provided for this kind of extremity, the extremity itself. Waller's hypothesis is compelling and has been widely cited. It is also incomplete. Mass psychogenic illness is real and well documented in the modern medical literature, but the Strasbourg dancing epidemic was unusual in its scale, its duration, and the specific physiological damage it produced. Most documented cases of mass psychogenic illness resolved within hours or days. The 1518 epidemic lasted weeks. Deaths from exhaustion are not typically a feature of psychogenic episodes. A competing hypothesis proposes ergot as the mechanism. Ergot is a fungus that colonizes rye grain, and in conditions of crop failure and food desperation, exactly the conditions of Strasbourg in 1518, contaminated grain might have been consumed by the urban poor who had no access to uncontaminated alternatives. Ergot poisoning produces convulsions, hallucinations, and spasms. From the outside, a convulsing, hallucinating person might look like someone dancing uncontrollably. The problem with the ergot hypothesis is that ergot poisoning classically produces vasoconstriction and immobility. The characteristic symptom is called St. Anthony's fire, and it typically manifests as burning sensations in the extremities and gangrene, not dancing. It does not obviously produce the sustained, repetitive, rhythmic movement that the 1518 accounts describe. No hypothesis has been universally accepted. The dancing plague of 1518 remains, in the technical language of medical history, an anomalous event whose mechanism is contested and whose full explanation has not been achieved. Similar episodes of mass dancing occurred in the same region in 1374, and at other points in medieval European history, in Aachen, in Cologne, in Metz. None matched the scale or documentation of 1518. All shared certain characteristics. They occurred in periods of social and economic stress. They involved populations with strong devotional relationships to Saint Vitus, and they produced genuine physical harm in the people they affected. They were not performances. They were not celebrations. They were something that happened to people who did not want it to happen. Frau Troffea, who started it all, disappears from the historical record after the first week of the epidemic. She is not mentioned in the accounts of its resolution. Whether she was among those who recovered, among those who did not, or whether she was taken to Saverne and came back changed, or not at all, the records do not say. She walked into the street in the summer of 1518 and began to move, and the movement spread, and then stopped, and she is not in the record after that. 500 years have passed since the streets of Strasbourg held 400 people who could not stop moving. The city rebuilt itself around the event, as cities do, and the event became a footnote, and then a curiosity, and then a subject of academic study. The people who danced through that summer, who bled through their shoes and begged to stop and kept going anyway, left no words of their own. Only the records of those who watched them, trying to understand what they were seeing.